This story doesn't start with a man tied to the train tracks. It starts 20 years earlier, when a powerful mining company vanished, leaving behind a small forgotten town and a terrible secret buried deep in the earth beneath it. For 2 decades, that secret was protected by the most powerful man in town. He thought it was safe. He thought it was silent. He never counted on two little girls hunting for scrap metal and the loyal dog who sensed a darkness no one else could see. Stay with me, and I will show you how one single act of courage didn't just save a man's life, it unraveled a conspiracy that an entire town had tried to forget. Every conspiracy, no matter how perfect, has a weak point, a single loose thread that, if pulled, can unravel everything. In the forgotten town of Blackwater Creek, West Virginia, that loose thread was a man named Ben Carter, Deputy Ben Carter. He was a good man in a town that had learned to survive by looking the other way. He had started asking questions nobody wanted answered. Questions about old cases, missing people from 2 decades ago, cases that the town's long-retired sheriff had buried under mountains of paperwork and indifference. Ben Carter was getting too close to the truth. And so, the powerful, unseen hands that ran Blackwater Creek decided he needed to be silenced. It wasn't a random attack. It was a professional hit, cold and calculated. They ambushed him on a lonely stretch of road after a late-night patrol. They overpowered him quickly, efficiently. There was no conversation, no demands, just the brutal certainty of their actions. They gagged him, blindfolded him, and dragged him to the place where secrets in this town were meant to die. The old, rusted railroad tracks that cut through the woods like a scar. They tied him down with thick nylon rope, securing his hands and feet to the cold, unforgiving steel. This wasn't just a murder, it was a message. A body found on the tracks is a tragedy, a horrific accident. There are no witnesses, no clues, just the roar of a freight train and a story that ends before it can be told. Lying there with the taste of rust and blood in his mouth and the cold iron pressing against his spine, Ben Carter knew this was the end. He was the first domino pushed over and meant to be forgotten. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They planned for everything, except for the poverty that haunted the edges of their town. They didn't plan for Maya and Chloe Reed. The 11-year-old twin sisters weren't looking for adventure that morning. They were working. Their job, a grim daily ritual, was to walk those same abandoned tracks, hunting for scrap metal, old cans, discarded pipes, anything they could sell to help their sick mother, Sarah, buy another week's worth of medicine. Their world was one of survival, a place of cracked hands and empty stomachs. And they didn't plan for Ranger, their loyal German shepherd, a grizzled old dog with a bad leg and senses that were sharper than any man's. As the girls scoured the gravel, Ranger froze. It wasn't the playful stance he took for squirrels. His body went rigid, his ears locked forward, and a low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest. It was a sound of pure, instinctual warning. He smelled something wrong, something deeply, fundamentally unnatural. And then, over the whisper of the wind, they all heard it, a faint, muffled groan. And in the distance, the low hum of the tracks coming to life. The girls ran. What they found was a nightmare. A man blindfolded and bound, lying helpless in the path of an oncoming train. Panic seized them, but desperation is a powerful fuel. With the train's horn wailing, a sound that grew from a distant moan to a deafening scream, they fought. Their small fingers, raw and clumsy, tore at the thick, stubborn knots. The train was a monster of steel and thunder, bearing down on them, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. "Pull!" Maya screamed, her voice lost in the roar. They grabbed Ben's uniform. Ranger, understanding without being told, clamped his teeth onto the thick fabric of the man's shoulder and pulled with all his might. They scrambled. They slipped. They dragged his dead weight over the gravel, clearing one rail, then the next. They fell back, panting and sobbing, just as the train thundered past. A blur of wind and metal that missed them by inches. They thought they had just saved a stranger's life. They had no idea they had just declared war on a secret that had owned their town for 20 years. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always leave a trace. Sometimes it's not a clue left behind, but a life that was meant to be taken, but wasn't. True courage is not the absence of fear. It's the desperate primal instinct to act when everything inside you is screaming to run away. But saving Ben Carter's life didn't end the threat. It only made the shadows angry. And now those shadows knew the names: Maya and Chloe Reed. A week after the rescue, a fragile quiet had settled over Blackwater Creek. The town whispered about the miracle on the tracks, but it was a nervous kind of talk, the kind people use when they're afraid to look too closely at something. Deputy Ben Carter was recovering, his survival a living, breathing problem for the people who had tried to make him disappear. For them, the first domino had tipped, but it hadn't fallen. It was still wobbling, threatening to bring everything else down with it. But for the Reed family, these whispers meant nothing. Their reality was much simpler and much harsher. Their mother Sarah's cough had grown worse, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to shake the very walls of their tiny home. The few dollars from their last trip to the scrapyard were gone, spent on medicine that didn't seem to be working. So driven by a quiet desperation that was as familiar as hunger, Maya and Chloe returned to the woods. They returned to the tracks. They didn't go back looking for heroes or villains. They went back looking for cans, for copper pipes, for anything the world had deemed worthless. Their poverty pushed them further down the line this time, past the familiar bends and into a section that hadn't seen a train in years. The rails were almost completely swallowed by weeds and rust. It was a place where things went to be forgotten. And that's where Chloe found it. It wasn't a piece of metal glinting in the sun. It was the opposite. It was a dark shape, almost invisible against the dark earth, half buried under a pile of rusted nails and shattered glass near a fork in the tracks. She knelt, her small gloved fingers digging into the cold ground, and pulled it free. It was a small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox. The wood was dark and warped with age, its corners banded with tarnished brass. It felt heavy, important. "You think it's worth anything?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. June came over and tilted her head. "Looks too rotted to be worth much." "Still," Chloe finished, "someone left it out here for a reason. They put it in the burlap sack with the rest of the day's meager findings. They thought it might hold old coins or maybe some antique jewelry, a small, forgotten treasure that could buy their mother a little more time. They had no idea what kind of treasure they had truly found." That evening, Ben Carter stopped by. He didn't come in his uniform. He came as a friend, carrying a paper sack with canned milk and a new heavy-duty flashlight. He placed the supplies on the peeling kitchen counter, his movements slow and still stiff from his injuries. And then he saw it, the box, sitting on the floor by Chloe's coat. His friendly demeanor vanished instantly. The warmth left his eyes, replaced by the sharp, focused gaze of a lawman. He walked over with a slow, deliberate purpose that made the air in the small room feel tight. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice low. "Near the split track," Chloe said, chewing on her thumbnail. "It was half buried." Ben crouched, his fingers brushing the worn insignia on the lid. It was a faded crest, barely visible, a pickaxe crossed with a single, stylized flame. He let out a slow breath through his nose. "Iron Ridge Mining," he said, almost to himself. June, who was always listening, narrowed her eyes. "That's the mining place, right? The one that closed down." "Yes, 20 years ago," Ben said, his voice tight. "After a federal investigation into forced labor and illegal confinement. Most of the case files were sealed, buried." He ran a thumb along the brass band on the box. "But this mark, this wasn't on any of their public company logos. This is internal. This is a symbol for something they didn't want the world to see." The hinges were rusted shut, but with a butter knife from the kitchen drawer, they managed to pry it open. The air that escaped smelled of damp earth, machine oil, and old forgotten paper. There were no coins, no jewels. Inside, under layers of crumbling documents, was a folded piece of parchment. Elias unfolded it carefully on the table. It was a hand-drawn map of the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the old Iron Ridge mine. But it wasn't a mining map. Sections were labeled with strange notations. Tunnels were marked in red ink that had faded to the color of old blood, and one symbol was repeated over and over again in key locations, a small triangle drawn inside a perfect circle. This wasn't a map of a place to dig for coal. It was the blueprint of a prison. It wasn't a treasure of gold they had found, but a treasure of truth. A key, not to a fortune, but to a dark history, crafted from rotted wood and buried secrets. The truth doesn't care if it's been forgotten. It waits patiently under the dirt and rust, ready to be found by those desperate enough to look. And with that key, Ben Carter now had a door to open. A door that led straight into the dark heart of Iron Ridge, and into a past that was about to connect to the Reed family in the most devastating way imaginable. As Deputy Ben Carter's borrowed truck disappeared down the dirt road, a map to a 20-year-old conspiracy lying on the passenger seat, a second, quieter investigation began. This one wasn't led by a lawman with a badge. It was led by an 11-year-old girl with a secret she didn't even know she was keeping. Before he left, Ben had looked Maya and Chloe in the eyes, his voice low and serious. "If anyone," he said, "anyone at all asks you about that box, you never saw it. You found nothing. Understood?" They both nodded. The danger was no longer a story they had stumbled upon. It was a shadow that now clung to their own doorstep. The next day at school, the world felt different. The familiar hallways, the drone of the teachers' voices, it all seemed muffled, distant. In the school library, a small quiet room that usually felt like a sanctuary, Chloe's world tilted once again. Their librarian, Ms. Evelyn Hayes, a kind woman with gentle eyes and a soft voice, was handing out flyers. It was State Awareness Week for missing children. The flyer was a grid of faces, black and white photos of teenagers who had vanished over the years. Chloe took the paper, her eyes scanning the rows of hopeful and haunted gazes. And then she saw it. One photo in the bottom right corner. A girl, maybe 17, with long, tangled hair and a crooked smile that seemed to be holding back a secret. Her eyes were deep-set, familiar. The name listed below was Leah Reed. Reed, the same as hers. In a town like Blackwater Creek, full of scattered kin and families that went back generations, a shared last name didn't always mean much. But Chloe couldn't look away. It was something in the eyes. The way the girl in the photo looked like she was holding back laughter, or maybe pain, or maybe both. It was a look Chloe sometimes saw in her own mother's eyes, in the quiet moments when she thought no one was watching. That night, long after Maya was asleep, Chloe was guided by a feeling she couldn't name. It was a mix of dread and a powerful, magnetic curiosity. She crept into the back corner of the small room she shared with her mother, where an old, rusted metal cookie tin was hidden under a loose floorboard. This was her mother's secret box, a place of forbidden memories. She had never dared to open it before. With a butter knife from the kitchen, her heart pounding against her ribs, she pried the lid open. The sound was a soft, metallic groan in the silent house. Inside, it smelled of old paper and rust. It was filled with folded receipts, dried flowers, scraps of paper with lists written on them. And near the bottom she found it, a letter, the paper yellowed and soft with age, folded into a tiny square. A letter that had never been sent. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was her mother's. "Dear Leah," it began, "I know they say it's foolish to write you, but I have to. Your sisters ask about you now and then, more in the quiet than aloud. I tell them you were bright, that you liked shiny things, that you braided my hair better than I could ever do yours. I remember the way you used to hum when you thought no one was listening. I pray you're still humming somewhere, my sweet girl." Chloe read the words twice, 3 times. The air left her lungs. Your sisters, Maya and Chloe. They had a sister named Leah, a ghost who had lived in this house, in the silence between words and the sadness of their mother's eyes. Behind the letter there was one more thing, a photograph, slightly faded. In it stood a much younger, happier version of her mother, Sarah. And hugging her tightly was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, with a crooked, gap-toothed smile and familiar, mischievous eyes. Leah, her sister. Chloe carefully folded the letter and put it back, placing the photograph on top of it. She closed the lid of the tin box and slid it back under the floorboard. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She just sat there in the dark, the weight of her discovery a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The grand conspiracy of the Iron Ridge mine was no longer a story about a bad man or a hidden map. It was now a story about her family. It had a name and a face, and it was the face of the ghost who was supposed to be her sister. The greatest pains are often the ones that are never spoken of. They live in the quiet spaces, in the names that are never mentioned, and the photographs hidden at the bottom of a rusted tin box. A family story is written not only in what is said, but in everything that is left unsaid. As Ben Carter drove toward the FBI armed with a map to a physical prison, Chloe Reed sat in her room, holding the map to her family's broken heart, and soon both maps would lead to the same dark place. The map was not a treasure. It was a floor plan for hell. As Deputy Ben Carter drove the long, winding road out of Blackwater Creek toward the state capitol, the folded parchment on his passenger seat felt heavier than any stone. It was a physical piece of the town's rotten core, a history of pain drawn in faded ink. He was no longer just a small-town cop chasing a hunch. He was a messenger, carrying evidence of a decades-old evil to a world that had long since turned its back on his forgotten corner of West Virginia. The FBI field office was a world away from Blackwater Creek. It was a place of clean lines, polished floors, and cool, sterile air. Ben met with Special Agent Eva Rostova, a woman whose sharp, intelligent eyes seemed to see right through him. She wasn't dismissive. She wasn't skeptical. She listened, her expression unreadable, as Ben laid out the story: the attack, the rescue, the box, the map. He unfolded the parchment on her desk. She studied it for a long moment. Then Ben pointed to the recurring symbol, the one he couldn't decipher, the small triangle inside a perfect circle. Agent Rostova's professional calm didn't break, but Ben saw a subtle tightening in her jaw. She knew the symbol. "It's a holding marker," she said, her voice low and even, stripped of all emotion. "Used by trafficking organizations during pre-transfer operations. They use it on internal maps to mark temporary holding sites for victims." The clinical, detached words hit Ben like a physical blow. The vague, shadowy evil he had been chasing now had a name that made his blood run cold: human trafficking. "The location," Rostova continued, tapping the map, "it aligns with the coordinates for the defunct Iron Ridge Shaft number 3. The conspiracy was real, and it was infinitely worse than he had ever dared to imagine. They returned to Blackwater Creek not as a lone deputy, but as a force. A quiet, professional team in dark, unmarked vehicles. They didn't approach the main entrance to the mine, the one that was collapsed and boarded up for show. They went to the place Ranger had found, the hidden drainage tunnel near the fork in the tracks. Ben's loyal dog seemed to understand the shift in gravity. He didn't need a command. He moved to the front of the formation, his gait steady despite his old injury. He was their guide into the underworld. The air that poured from the tunnel was cold and stale. It smelled of mildew, rust, and something else. The faint, almost imperceptible scent of unwashed bodies and human fear. The agents moved in single file, their footsteps silent on the damp ground, weapons held low. The only sounds were the drip of water from the tunnel ceiling and the soft padding of Ranger's paws on the packed earth. At the end of the tunnel, just as the map had shown, was a door. It was a heavy modern steel door, completely out of place, bolted directly into the ancient rock face, a new scar on an old wound. This was it. This was the entrance to the prison. The team's technician breached the lock with a quiet hiss of hydraulics. They swung the door open into absolute darkness and silence. They moved inside, flashlights cutting sharp, nervous beams through the oppressive black. The tunnel bent, then widened into a larger, man-made cavern. And there, in the center of the cold, concrete floor, they found the evidence of life. It was a scene of chilling emptiness. There were no people, no guards, just the ghosts of them. Dirty, threadbare blankets were piled in a corner, still holding the faint shape of the bodies that had huddled there for warmth. A few empty plastic bowls were scattered nearby, one with a smear of dried food still stuck to the bottom. In another corner, a small pile of cut plastic wristbands, the kind used to tag prisoners or livestock. And then Ben's flashlight beam fell on the most haunting detail of all. Lying on its side, alone in the middle of the floor, was a single woman's shoe. It was small, canvas, and worn through at the toe. a simple, everyday object that screamed of the violence that had happened here. Ben walked slowly to the damp rock wall, pressing his hand against its cold surface. The air was thick with despair. He could feel it. He could taste it. Agent Rostova came to his side, her own face grim in the harsh light of her flashlight. "They moved them," she said, her voice a low, angry whisper. "But not long ago. We just missed them." They were standing in a cage that had just been emptied. They had found the belly of the beast, but the beast had already moved on, leaving behind only the heartbreaking proof of its prey and the chilling promise that the hunt was far from over. Evil doesn't always live in hellfire and screams. Sometimes it lives in the quiet, cold silence of an empty room, in the shape of a blanket, in the presence of a single forgotten shoe. There is a unique kind of pain in confirming your worst fears. It's the moment suspicion turns into horrifying certainty, and the fight becomes terrifyingly real. But the empty room was not a dead end. It was a declaration of war. And Ben Carter knew that to find the girls, including Leah, they didn't need to find where they went. They needed to find the man who had moved them. The empty chamber felt like a tomb, a cold, silent monument to their failure. The trail had gone cold. The agents moved with a grim, methodical purpose, photographing the blankets, bagging the single shoe, documenting the ghosts. For a moment, it seemed the beast had won, slinking away into the darkness with its prey just moments before they arrived. Ben Carter felt a familiar, bitter taste of defeat rise in his throat. He had come so close only to find an empty cage. But then, a sound cut through the heavy silence, a single, sharp bark. It was Ranger. While the humans were documenting the past, the dog was focused on the present. He wasn't interested in the empty bowls or the discarded blankets. He was standing at the far wall of the chamber, a wall that looked like solid, unbroken rock. He was staring at it, his body rigid, his tail low and stiff. He barked again, a persistent, insistent sound that echoed in the dead air. It was a command. "Look here." Agent Rostova, who had learned to trust the dog's instincts more than her own eyes, walked over. "What is it, boy?" she murmured. She ran her gloved hand along the rock face, and then she felt it. A seam. A thin, almost invisible line that didn't follow the natural grain of the stone. "We've got another door," she called out, her voice sharp with renewed urgency. "It's concealed." This wasn't on the map. This was the real prison, the one hidden even from the conspirators' own records. The tension in the chamber became electric. They weren't just clearing a crime scene anymore. They were on the verge of a rescue. The team's technician worked on the hidden lock, his movements precise and silent. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, there was a soft, metallic click. The disguised door hissed open, revealing another corridor, darker and colder than the first. They entered single file, a spear of light and hope piercing the decades-old darkness. Ranger first, then Rostova, then Ben. The air here was different. It was thick with the stale scent of human fear. The corridor bent, then widened into a small, stark room. And there, huddled in the center under a single flickering bulb, were three figures. As the agents fanned out, one of the figures moved. A young woman, tall but painfully thin, scrambled to her feet. She put herself between the armed agents and the two smaller girls cowering behind her. Her face was bruised, her lips split, but her eyes burned with a defiant fire that no amount of darkness had been able to extinguish. "Don't touch them," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "I'm the one you want." The raw courage of her words hung in the air. Ben's heart ached. He holstered his weapon and slowly knelt, making himself smaller, less of a threat. "We're not here to hurt you," he said softly. "We're here to take you home. What's your name?" The girl's gaze flicked from Ben's face to Rostova's, and then finally to Ranger, who had come to a stop and was looking at her, his head tilted with a gentle curiosity. Her defiance wavered, replaced by a deep, soul-crushing weariness. "Is this real?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I've had this dream before." "This is real," Ben promised. "What's your name?" She took a shaky breath. "Leah," she said, the name a strange sound on her own lips. "My name is Leah Reed." The dominoes had all fallen. The grand conspiracy and the private, heartbreaking secret of the Reed family were one and the same. As medics rushed in to help, an agent's voice crackled over the radio from outside. "We've got movement at the ridge. Subject is attempting to flee." The king was abandoning his castle. Marcus Thorne, the retired sheriff, the patriarch of this town's decay, made a coward's run for it. His escape was a pathetic scramble towards a beat-up pickup truck hidden under a camouflage tarp. But he hadn't counted on the FBI's perimeter. He hadn't counted on his world unraveling so fast. Two agents tackled him just as the truck's engine sputtered. He hit the frozen earth with a grunt, cursing, fighting like a cornered rat. He was older now, his face bloated and gray, but the smug cruelty in his eyes was unchanged. As Ben Carter approached, Thorne spat a mouthful of blood and dirt onto the ground. "I should have buried you deeper, Carter," he snarled. Ben looked down at the man who had haunted his career and his town for 20 years. The man who had stolen a child from her family. He felt no rage, only a cold, final sense of justice. "And yet, here we are," Ben replied, his voice flat and steady. "Shame your secrets weren't buried with you." In the end, the king of Blackwater Creek's rotten empire didn't fall because of a grand strategy. He fell because of a dog that wouldn't give up, a deputy who wouldn't stay silent, and a girl who had forgotten her own name, but never forgot how to be brave. There is no darkness so absolute that it cannot be broken by a single point of light, and sometimes that light is the defiant spirit of one unbroken soul. The king had fallen and his lost princess had been found. But could a family torn apart by 2 decades of secrets and sorrow ever truly be made whole again? The courtroom in Blackwater Creek hadn't seen this many people in decades. The air was thick with a tension that was part anger, part relief, and part a profound collective sorrow for all that had been lost. Marcus Thorne, once the town's untouchable king, sat handcuffed at the defense table, a hollowed-out man stripped of all his power. Judge Miriam Hawthorne, a woman whose gaze carried the weight of the law, delivered the sentence without ceremony. 45 years. No parole. Justice, it turned out, had not forgotten Blackwater Creek after all. It had just taken the long way around. But the real story wasn't ending in that courtroom. It was just beginning. Quietly, awkwardly, in a small, clean duplex on the other side of town that Ben Carter had helped the Reed family secure. The reunion was not like something from a movie. It was fragile and uncertain. Leah, the ghost sister, walked into her family's life like a stranger. She didn't know how to be a daughter to a mother she barely remembered, or a sister to 2 girls she had never met. Maya and Chloe didn't know what to say to this tall, quiet young woman who had their mother's eyes but a haunted look all her own. The silence was broken by Chloe. She stepped forward and silently offered Leah the small, embroidered square of cloth she had been clutching. On it were 3 stitched flowers, and a new one she had added, the shape of a dog. Leah took it, her fingers trembling as she traced the crude stitches. And then, for the first time, she cried. She dropped to her knees and hugged her little sisters, her sobs the sound of a dam breaking after 20 years. "I waited so long for someone to remember me," she whispered into their shoulders. And Chloe whispered back, "We never forgot." In the weeks that followed, the town celebrated its other hero. Shiloh, now just called Ranger by everyone, wore a velvet collar with a silver medal and patiently allowed every child in town to pet him. But the real healing was happening away from the crowds. Maggie, their mother with access to proper care, began to regain her strength. Her cough softened. Color returned to her cheeks. And Leah began the long, difficult work of coming home to herself. She didn't hide from the world. She walked right back into its heart. She started volunteering at a new community center for victims of trauma. She sat with women who were too afraid to speak. She held the hands of children who flinched at loud noises. She wasn't proving anything. She was simply healing in the same direction as they were. She was turning her pain into a source of shelter for others. On the first warm day of March, when the last of the snow had melted and the air smelled of thawed earth, the 3 sisters returned to the tracks. The place hadn't changed, but they had. They brought with them a small apple sapling, its roots bundled in burlap. Together they dug into the stubborn, winter-hardened soil, just a few steps from where they had found the rusted box. When the roots were buried, Leah tied a faded red ribbon from their mother's old dress around the narrow trunk. June looked up at the fragile tree. "Do you think it'll survive?" Leah's voice was soft, but for the first time it was completely steady. "It will," she said. "This place once buried me, but now it's where I begin again." In the end, true justice isn't found in a courtroom verdict. It's found in the quiet, difficult work of rebuilding a life, of planting a tree in frozen ground, and of choosing to believe in spring after a long, brutal winter. Our scars do not tell the story of our weakness. They tell the story of what we have survived. They are a testament to the strength we found when we thought we had none left. The tree was just a sapling, small and fragile, but it was there. And for the first time in a very long time, so was the entire Reed family. Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or trumpets. They don't arrive as grand, earth-shattering events. They arrive quietly. They show up in the form of a loyal dog who refuses to give up a scent. They're found in the courage of two little girls who choose to run toward danger instead of away from it. And they live in the silent, unbreakable strength of a young woman who survives the unimaginable and then chooses to help others heal. In our own lives, we may not all uncover secret maps or escape hidden prisons, but every single one of us is called to notice those who are trapped in the quiet prisons of their own pain. We are all called to be the hands that help, the voice that says, "You are not forgotten," and the heart that reminds someone that they are seen. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that hope can grow in the most broken of places, please share it with someone who might need to hear that message today. We read every single one of your comments, and they mean the world to us, so please let us know your thoughts below. And to stay connected with more stories of resilience, love, and faith, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you for listening.